It is the summer of 1944, somewhere in the rolling farmland of Normandy, and a German Hauptmann, a captain, is standing with his hands raised above his head. Beside him, 43 of his men are doing the same. They are not surrounded by tanks. They have not been hit by artillery. No aircraft has screamed overhead. In fact, the man responsible for their surrender is sitting approximately 30 meters away in a shallow ditch, wearing a mud-caked battle dress, holding what appears to be, and this is the part that has confused historians for decades, a teacup. Not a wireless set, not a pistol, not a grenade, a teacup. What happened in that ditch on that particular August morning is one of the most quietly extraordinary stories of the Second World War. It is a story about British stubbornness, German psychology, a handful of remarkably clever men working in a drafty Bedfordshire country house, and the peculiar genius of making the enemy believe something that isn't quite true. It involves deception, acoustics, a significant amount of careful engineering, and, at its heart, the finest tradition of the British officer class, the absolute, unshakable confidence that comes from holding a warm cup of tea. But before you dismiss this as a charming anecdote from the fringes of the war, consider what that surrender actually meant. 44 armed men in good defensive positions, with ammunition and orders to hold their ground, laid down their weapons because of what they heard. Not what they saw. What they heard. And what they heard came out of a device so deceptively simple, so seemingly absurd, that the Germans who later examined captured versions of it refused, for some time, to believe it could possibly have worked. This is the story of the British sonic deception program, and the device at its heart that operators nicknamed, with typically understated British humour, the teacup. To understand why the teacup existed, you have to understand the particular misery of the Normandy campaign in the weeks that followed D-Day. By late June and July of 1944, Allied forces had established their beachhead, but progress inland was grinding, brutal, and desperately slow. The landscape of the bocage, the dense network of hedgerows, sunken lanes, and ancient earthworks that carved up the Norman countryside, had turned the campaign into something that felt uncomfortably close to the static warfare of the previous war. Every field was a potential fortress. Every tree line concealed a machine gun position. The problem, as British Army commanders identified with increasing frustration, was not always firepower. It was information. Specifically, the Germans' ability to hold position even when tactically compromised, because they could not be sure of what exactly was coming at them. A well-trained German unit in a good defensive position could hold against a numerically superior attacking force simply by staying calm, staying organized, and waiting to see what materialized. Panic, on the other hand, was catastrophic. A unit that believed it was about to be outflanked, surrounded, or overwhelmed by armor it couldn't see would behave very differently from one that knew the precise nature of the threat it faced. What the British needed, in plain terms, was a reliable way to make German soldiers think they were hearing something they were not. Specifically, the sound of tanks. Lots of tanks, moving in directions they weren't actually moving. This was not an entirely new idea. Sonic deception had been attempted in various crude forms during the First World War, and the Americans had their own program, the so-called Ghost Army, which used enormous loudspeakers mounted on lorries to broadcast the recorded sounds of armored movement. The American system worked, up to a point, but it had serious limitations. The loudspeakers were enormous, visible for considerable distances, and the recordings played through the technology of the early 1940s had a quality that experienced German soldiers could sometimes, under the right conditions, identify as artificial. The sound was loud. It was not always convincing. The British solution to this problem came from a most unlikely direction. The facility that produced the Teacup was not, by any conventional measure, a military establishment. Whaddon Hall, in Buckinghamshire, was the kind of rambling English country house that looks better in watercolours than in architectural drawings. Drafty, inconvenient, sprawling, and absolutely perfect for secret work. It had been requisitioned early in the war and was home to a rotating cast of wireless engineers, acoustic specialists, former BBC technicians, and the occasional musician whose precise contribution to the war effort remains, to this day, somewhat vaguely documented. The core problem the Whaddon team faced was not recording the sounds. That was relatively straightforward. They had access to the real thing: Churchill tanks, Cromwells, American Shermans, all driven across gravel and mud at various speeds, while engineers with sensitive microphones crouched at various distances and made careful notes. The recordings were meticulous. What they captured, the low metallic groan of tank tracks, the deep idle of a heavy diesel engine, the particular crunch of armoured vehicles turning, was genuinely unsettlingly convincing when played back in the right conditions. The problem was playback. The American loudspeaker lorries broadcast at enormous volume, which carried distance but sacrificed quality. At high volume, the compression artifacts in the recording became audible. The sound, as one German signals officer later noted in a post-war debrief, had edges. It sounded like a recording. The Whaddon team's solution was counterintuitive. Instead of making the sound louder, they made it quieter, considerably quieter, and they distributed it. The Teacup, named for the rough similarity of its primary component to a large ceramic mug, was, at its core, a precision speaker assembly roughly 22 centimeters in diameter and perhaps 18 centimeters deep, weighing approximately 1.4 kilograms. It was designed to operate at low volume, producing sound at a level roughly equivalent to a conversation across a dinner table. But it was engineered to reproduce frequencies with a fidelity that the large American systems could not match, particularly in the lower registers. The bass frequencies that the human body feels as much as hears, and which carry through earth and hedgerow in ways that higher frequencies do not. The device ran off a portable battery unit, could be carried in a standard army kit bag, and was operated via a small control box, approximately the size of a hardback novel, that allowed the user to select from a series of recorded sequences and adjust playback speed. This last feature was critical. By varying the playback speed slightly, a trained operator could simulate the sound of vehicles accelerating, decelerating, or changing direction in real time in response to what he could see and hear around him. The Teacup itself, the speaker assembly, could be placed on the ground, half buried in a ditch, or wedged against a tree root. It required no special mounting. At low volume, in the open air, it was virtually inaudible beyond 30 meters. But through earth, through hedgerow roots, through the ground itself, the sound travelled considerably further, arriving attenuated, muffled, directionally ambiguous. Exactly as a distant column of armour would sound to a nervous soldier in a defensive position, straining to hear through the pre-dawn dark. Production figures remain partially classified, but estimates from post-war supply records suggest that somewhere between 180 and 240 Teacup units were manufactured between early 1944 and the end of the war, at a facility in the Midlands, whose identity has never been officially confirmed. The operational use of the Teacup was, by its very nature, difficult to document. The men who operated these devices, drawn primarily from specialist sections of the Royal Signals, and what were described in official paperwork with magnificent vagueness as miscellaneous attached personnel were not encouraged to keep detailed diaries. After action reports were deliberately sparse. What can be established from the available record is this. Teacup units were deployed at multiple points during the advance through Normandy and into the Low Countries, typically operated in pairs by two-man teams who would move ahead of the main advance under cover of darkness, positioning the devices to suggest armored movement on a flank or along an approach route. The Germans were watching carefully. The results, where they can be measured, were striking. Several German unit commanders interviewed post-war described incidents in which they had ordered withdrawals or surrendered positions based on what they believed was an imminent armored envelopment, only to discover, sometimes hours later, that no armour had been present in that sector at all. If you are finding this interesting, a quick subscribe helps more than you know. It keeps this kind of forgotten history coming. One particularly well-documented incident, mentioned briefly in the post-war debrief records of a German infantry battalion, describes a company-level position near Falaise, abandoning a well-prepared defensive line in the early hours of August 14, 1944, after the sentries reported hearing tank engines on three sides. No tanks were found to have been present. The company's withdrawal exposed a flanking position that a British unit then took without significant resistance. The psychological mechanics were straightforward, and the Wadden team had understood them from the beginning. An experienced soldier knows what a tank sounds like. He has heard them in training, in battle, in the grey pre-dawn of too many mornings. When he hears that sound again, especially when he hears it where he did not expect it, where his maps say there should be nothing, his body reacts before his mind does. The response is visceral, immediate, and very difficult to override through rational analysis, especially when exhausted, cold, and already under strain. The Germans, for their part, had their own sonic deception research, though it followed a notably different philosophy. German acoustic work focused primarily on large-scale battlefield sound masking, using recorded noise to conceal the movement of actual armored formations. This was not deception in the offensive sense, but concealment, and it required considerably more infrastructure. The primary German system, developed by a signals research unit attached to OKH in late 1943, used trailer-mounted speaker arrays that required a dedicated vehicle and a crew of 4. It was effective at its intended purpose, but utterly impractical for the kind of nimble, small-unit deception the Teacup was designed for. The American Ghost Army's loudspeaker operations were bolder in conception and considerably larger in scale. At their most ambitious, American sonic deception units broadcast from multiple lorries simultaneously to simulate entire divisional movements. The effect was impressive. The subtlety was not. German signals intelligence was, by 1944, adept at identifying the electromagnetic signature of high-power audio amplification equipment, and there are documented cases of Ghost Army operations being partially compromised because the enemy detected the power draw of the American equipment before the deception was fully established. The Teacup produced no such signature. It drew less current than a bedside lamp. It was invisible to any detection technology the Germans possessed, because it was simply too small and too low-powered to register. The genius was not technological sophistication, but technological restraint. The British had realized typically that the answer was to do less, more carefully, rather than more loudly. Assessing the actual impact of the Teacup program on the outcome of the war is genuinely difficult, and it would be dishonest to overstate it. The liberation of Western Europe was decided by millions of men, thousands of tanks, and years of industrial production on a scale that dwarfs any single device or program. The teacup did not win the war. What it did, arguably, was save lives. Positions taken without resistance were positions where no one had to die. Withdrawals induced by the sound of phantom armour were withdrawals that might otherwise have cost significant casualties to achieve by conventional means. In the grinding arithmetic of the Normandy campaign, those savings mattered. There is also a legacy that extends beyond the immediate conflict. The principle demonstrated by the teacup, that low-power, high-fidelity deception is more effective than high-power, low-fidelity deception, became a significant influence on post-war British thinking about electronic and acoustic warfare. The idea that the most effective deception is the one that fits seamlessly into the enemy's existing picture of the world, rather than screaming for attention, can be traced in a fairly direct line from the Wadden programme through to British electronic warfare doctrine as it developed through the Cold War. No teacup unit is, to public knowledge, preserved in any British military museum. If any survive, they are almost certainly in private hands, unrecognised, their provenance unknown. The men who operated them left, for the most part, no record that acknowledged their specific role. Their operational reports, where they exist, describe equipment in deliberately vague terms that give nothing away. And so we return to that Normandy ditch, to the captain with his hands raised, to the 43 men standing in a summer field with weapons lowered, listening to sounds that were not quite what they seemed. The British soldier in the ditch was, by all accounts, a signals corporal from the Midlands, a former draftsman's apprentice who had spent 2 years learning to operate a device the size of a hat box. He had moved into position in the dark, 4 hours before dawn, guided by a hand-drawn map and his own careful judgment. He had placed his teacup against the root of a hedgerow elm, connected his battery, selected his sequence, and waited. What the German captain heard, rising through the ground and through the heavy morning air, was the unmistakable sound of armoured vehicles, many of them, moving steadily, coming from the east and the south simultaneously. He could not see them. He could not raise his headquarters for clarification. And he had been a soldier long enough to know that when you cannot see the tanks and you can hear them, the time for measured consideration has already passed. He made the only sensible decision available to him. He ordered his men to lay down their arms. The sound that had defeated him was running off a battery not much larger than the ones used in a wireless set. The speaker it came from was roughly the size of a biscuit tin. The technology behind it was, in essence, a very good gramophone record, played very quietly by a very patient man who had spent the entire night lying in a ditch in the dark. This was British military innovation at its most characteristic, unglamorous, precise, quietly devastating, and entirely impossible to take seriously until the moment it worked. The teacup, it turned out, was mightier than the tank, at least when no one could tell the difference.